It all started years ago with one name and one silence. Cassie Ventura, before the headlines, before the trials, before Netflix, before the world decided to look. Back when Sean Diddy Combs was untouchable and Cassie was just another woman standing in his shadow trying to survive something no one was supposed to know about. For years, the story didn't move because power doesn't like being questioned, money doesn't like being exposed, and silence is easy to buy when fear does the work for you. But silence doesn't last forever, because once Cassie spoke, nothing ever went back to the way it was. What began as a closed-door relationship slowly turned into a chain reaction that nobody could stop. First came whispers, then lawsuits, then leaked details that felt too specific to ignore, and finally, Brie, the moment that cracked everything wide open, when the world realized this wasn't just about a celebrity scandal. It was about control. It was about what happens when someone believes their power will protect them forever. Fast forward to December 2nd, 2025. Netflix releases a documentary that instantly feels different. Not polished, not distant, not careful. Sean Combs' The Reckoning, produced by 50 Cent. And within hours of its release, social media isn't debating opinions. It's dissecting evidence. Hidden videos people claim they'd never seen. Private calls that sound like they were never meant to leave the room. Security footage. Late-night meetings. After-hours parties. Moments frozen in time that suddenly make years of rumors feel disturbingly real. The public reaction is immediate. Angry, loud, relentless. Victims speak again. Old stories resurface. Media pressure explodes. And behind the scenes, something even more dangerous starts happening. Legal attention shifts. Because when material like that enters the conversation, it doesn't just damage reputations. It forces institutions to ask whether justice stopped too early. That's how we arrive at Friday, December 19th, 2025. Manhattan, Southern District of New York. No press release, no announcement, just an emergency court action that catches everyone off guard. Outside the courthouse, chaos builds. Reporters rush in from every direction. Cameras roll even though they're not allowed inside. People gather behind barricades, shouting opposite demands. Some defending Diddy, others demanding accountability for Cassie. Inside it's colder, quieter, heavier. No cameras allowed, no media permitted. Only the people who matter and the truth they're about to confront. Diddy is brought into the courtroom through a secured entrance. Not the man from magazine covers, not the mogul from red carpets. Just a defendant walking into a room that suddenly feels much smaller than he remembers. Then Cassie enters with her legal team. She doesn't look at him. She doesn't need to. Everything she's carried for years is already in that room with her. Files, drives, material connected to the very footage millions just watched on Netflix. And that's when it becomes clear. This isn't about reducing a sentence. It's about whether the original sentence was enough at all. The judge enters. Judge Aaron Subramanian. One look around the courtroom and the message is clear. This hearing isn't routine. The gavel hits. Silence. Not the calm kind. The dangerous kind. Because everyone understands what this moment represents. Courts do not reopen conversations unless something threatens to change the outcome. And according to what's being claimed, what Cassie's team is referencing goes beyond allegations. It points to patterns. Diddy's lawyers try to regain control, objections, warnings about media influence, arguments about prejudice. But this time, the energy is different. The room isn't reacting to noise, it's reacting to weight. The judge reviews what's being submitted, timestamps, descriptions, connections to footage that the public has only seen pieces of. Diddy sits still, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the table. A man who once dictated rooms now waiting for one to decide his future. And here's the question that starts forming in everyone's mind at the same time. If the court is willing to look again, what did they just see that made walking away impossible? Before going deeper into this video, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon. That's how you'll never miss any breaking updates like this. Now let's get back to the story, because after that pause, after that moment where no one speaks, The judge uses a single word that shifts the entire room: reassessment. And when a court reassesses, it means the story isn't over. It means the consequences may only be beginning. The moment that word left the judge's mouth, the room stopped feeling like a courtroom and started feeling like a pressure chamber. Because reassessment doesn't mean review for curiosity. It means something new has entered the equation, something heavy enough to bend the original outcome. And according to people familiar with what unfolded, that something didn't come from a rumor, a tweet, or public outrage. It came from a chain reaction that began quietly months earlier, when Cassie made a decision she knew would change her life forever. For years, she had been painted as a footnote in someone else's story, a name attached to headlines but never fully heard. Every time she spoke, the world asked for more proof. Every time she stayed silent, the world assumed there was nothing to say. But silence wasn't absence. It was pressure. Behind closed doors, Cassie was assembling something far more dangerous than accusations. A record, not memories, materials. Pieces of moments that couldn't be argued away by charisma or money. Things that don't respond to spin. And when Netflix began developing Sean Combs, The Reckoning, that pressure finally found a release. What made the documentary different, according to people who worked around it, wasn't just who produced it. It was how much of it refused to soften the edges. It didn't rely on dramatic narration or reenactments alone. It leaned on fragments that felt raw, unfinished, uncomfortable. Viewers didn't feel entertained. They felt implicated. Every clip sparked questions. Why hadn't this been seen before? Who had it? Who buried it? And why did so many people suddenly recognize the same patterns repeating across different stories? That's when Cassie's legal team saw something shift. Because once the public recognizes a pattern, the system has to decide whether it ignored one. Behind the scenes, requests began circulating, not demands, inquiries. Quiet conversations between attorneys, observers, and people who understood how federal cases actually move. They weren't asking for revenge. They were asking whether everything had truly been weighed the first time. And that's when the material mattered most. Because what Cassie's team was prepared to reference wasn't just emotionally compelling. It was structurally dangerous. It suggested consistency, repetition, control, the kind of behavior that courts treat very differently once it's framed as a pattern instead of an incident. Inside the courtroom, as those references were laid out, Diddy's lawyers reportedly realized something was slipping away from them. You can argue perception, you can challenge intent, but you cannot easily explain away alignment, especially when multiple elements point in the same direction. Witness behavior, timing, footage placement, audio fragments that don't scream, they whisper, and whispers are often worse because they feel honest. Diddy's posture told its own story. Gone was the defiance. Gone was the confidence that once made headlines fold around him. He didn't look angry. He looked calculating, like a man trying to predict how much ground he was about to lose. Across the room, Cassie sat still, not triumphant, not emotional, just focused. People close to the case say that's what made the moment so unsettling. This wasn't chaos. It was clarity, the kind that comes after you've already lived through the worst part and decided you won't carry it alone anymore. As the judge reviewed the context, the implications became unavoidable. This wasn't about Netflix. It wasn't about public pressure. It was about whether the system had been asked to evaluate the full scope of something it once treated as limited. And when that realization settles in, there's no dramatic announcement, no shouting, no gavel slam that ends the conversation. There's just a quiet understanding that the story has entered a new phase. A phase where outcomes are no longer theoretical. Because reassessment doesn't ask, what happened? It asks, what does this mean now? And sitting in that room, according to those present, one thing became clear to everyone at the same time. This was no longer about what Diddy had already lost. It was about what he might never get back. After that moment, the room didn't loosen. It tightened. Not with tension you could hear, but with focus you could feel. This was where the hearing shifted from atmosphere to direction, where emotions stopped carrying weight, structure took over. According to those familiar with what happened next, the judge didn't raise his voice or lean back. He leaned in. And when he spoke again, the questions were no longer broad. They were surgical. He began tracing timelines, not just dates, but gaps, asking when certain material first existed, when it surfaced publicly, and, most importantly, why it had never fully entered the original record. Each question landed calmly, but the effect was immediate, because these weren't questions meant to challenge credibility. They were questions meant to expose absence, the kind of absence that benefits someone. Diddy's legal team responded carefully, choosing words that sounded precise but avoided expansion. They emphasized procedure, they emphasized scope, they framed the issue as timing, not substance, as context, not content. Their goal was clear: keep the frame narrow enough that the reassessment couldn't widen into something irreversible. But the judge didn't move on. He pressed again, not aggressively, deliberately. He asked whether material referenced publicly could be evaluated differently when it aligned with existing testimony, whether omission, intentional or not, had shaped the original understanding of scale, whether the court had been asked to evaluate moments when what now appeared was continuity, and in that instant, the temperature in the room changed. Because continuity is dangerous. Continuity suggests intention, it suggests opportunity, it suggests repetition. And courts do not treat repetition lightly. Diddy sat motionless as the exchange unfolded. Those watching closely noticed his posture stiffen, his hands tighten briefly before relaxing again. Not panic, calculation. The kind that comes when you realize the conversation you prepared for is no longer the one being held. Across the aisle, Cassie remained still. She didn't interrupt. She didn't gesture. She didn't need to. Everything the judge was asking existed independently of her voice. That was the point. The material didn't rely on persuasion. It relied on alignment. And alignment is difficult to dismiss once it's acknowledged. The judge paused, scanning documents in front of him, not skimming, comparing. He referenced prior findings, then current context, then the distance between the two. That distance mattered, because it suggested that something had been evaluated once and may need to be evaluated again under a different lens. For a brief moment, no one spoke, not because they were waiting for instruction, but because everyone understood what had just happened. The court wasn't reacting to pressure. It was identifying a discrepancy, and discrepancies don't fade with time. They demand explanation. When the judge finally spoke again, his words were measured, but unmistakable in intent. He made it clear that the court was not questioning credibility in isolation. It was questioning completeness, whether the framework used before still held under the weight of what now existed. That was the point where the defense strategy visibly shifted. Less pushback, more caution, shorter answers. Because when a judge starts questioning the frame itself, the outcome is no longer anchored to the past. It becomes open. And in that openness, one reality settled heavily over the room. This was no longer about defending a decision that had already been made. It was about whether that decision could still stand. The shift became impossible to ignore once the questions stopped circling the past and started closing in on responsibility. This was the moment when the defense realized the conversation had moved somewhere dangerous. Until now, everything had been about containment, keeping the scope narrow, keeping the record intact, keeping the reassessment from becoming a reckoning. But as the judge continued, it became clear that containment was no longer the objective of the court. Clarity was. According to those familiar with the exchange, the judge redirected the discussion toward relevance. Not relevance in the media sense, but relevance in the legal one. Whether material discussed publicly could be dismissed simply because of where it appeared, or whether its substance demanded examination, regardless of the platform that surfaced it. That distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit, because once relevance is established, origin stops being a shield. Diddy's legal team leaned heavily into one argument: influence. They framed the moment as one shaped by public reaction, documentary fallout, and external pressure. A warning, subtle but clear, that allowing such material to carry weight could set a precedent the court might later regret. But the judge didn't flinch. He listened. Then he responded by reframing the issue entirely. This was not about media impact. This was about evidentiary alignment. He pointed out that courts are not insulated from reality. They are tasked with interpreting it. And when multiple elements intersect in a way that reinforces existing testimony, the court has an obligation to ask whether omission, not inclusion, poses the greater risk. That line landed hard, because it flipped the defense's argument on its head. Suddenly, the danger wasn't that too much was being considered. It was that too little might have been. The room grew quieter. Diddy's attorneys adjusted their approach again, shortening responses, avoiding absolutes. Their confidence gave way to calculation. They weren't trying to win anymore. They were trying not to lose ground. Diddy himself remained seated, his stillness reading less like control and more like endurance. A man accustomed to shaping outcomes, now forced to wait for one. The distance between those two realities was visible on his face. Across from him, Cassie stayed composed. What struck observers was her restraint. She didn't react to arguments. She didn't track every exchange. She sat as someone who had already placed the truth where it belonged, and was no longer responsible for how it was received. The judge continued methodically, clarifying that reassessment does not imply guilt beyond what has been adjudicated, but it does imply responsibility to ensure the court's understanding matches the full scope of what exists. That sentence changed the tone entirely, because it acknowledged something rarely said aloud, that courts can miss things, not out of malice, but limitation. And when those limitations are exposed, correction is not optional. It's required. As the discussion moved toward procedural next steps, the implications sharpened. There was no dismissal, no reassurance that the matter would simply fade. Instead, there was acknowledgement that the review process had expanded, and with it, the range of possible outcomes. For those watching closely, this was the clearest signal yet. The door wasn't closing, it was widening. And as that reality settled in, one truth became unavoidable. Whatever happened next would not be shaped by argument alone. It would be shaped by what the court now understood it could no longer ignore. What happened next didn't feel dramatic. It felt inevitable. As the discussion moved forward, the courtroom atmosphere changed again, this time in a way that was harder to name. It wasn't tension anymore. It was gravity. The kind that pulls everything toward a conclusion long before the words are spoken. According to people familiar with the proceedings, the judge made it clear that the court was now operating in a different mode. This was no longer a moment for argument or persuasion. It was a phase of consideration. Quiet, controlled, deliberate. That distinction mattered, because consideration is where outcomes are shaped without spectacle. The court began outlining what would happen next, not as a promise, but as a process. Material referenced would not be weighed casually. It would be reviewed in full context, compared against what had already been established, and examined for consistency, scope, and relevance. Not publicly, not theatrically, but carefully. That was the signal. This wasn't ending today. And everyone in the room understood what that meant. Diddy's legal team absorbed the shift immediately. Their posture changed. Conversations that once sounded strategic now sounded cautious. No more bold framing, no more sweeping statements, just careful language, measured responses, and an unmistakable effort to slow the pace of what was unfolding. Because once a court commits to deeper review, speed becomes the enemy. Diddy himself remained quiet, but the change in him was unmistakable. This was no longer a situation he could manage through presence alone. The confidence that once filled rooms had given way to something heavier. Awareness. Awareness that the next phase wouldn't happen in public, but behind closed doors, where influence has no voice. Across the room, Cassie sat with the same stillness she'd carried all day. But those who noticed said it was different now. Less guarded, more settled. Not because she expected an outcome, but because the truth had finally been placed somewhere it couldn't be dismissed. Whatever happened next, it would happen without her having to fight for attention again. As the court prepared to conclude the session, there was no sense of closure, only direction, a clear understanding that the matter had moved forward into a space where consequences are calculated, not announced. Outside the courtroom, word began to spread in fragments. No confirmations, no dramatic headlines, just a quiet shift in tone among those who understood the system well enough to read between the lines. This wasn't a reset, it was a continuation. and continuations carry weight. Because once a case reaches this point, it stops being about what can be argued and starts being about what can withstand scrutiny over time. As the room emptied, the silence followed. Not awkward, not uncertain. Heavy, the kind that lingers because everyone knows the same thing. The most important decisions hadn't been made yet, but they were now unavoidable. As night settled over the city, the story didn't fade, it sharpened. This was the phase no one outside the system ever sees. No microphones, no cameras, just the quiet hum of decisions beginning to take shape. According to those familiar with the process, this was when the real weight of the day finally landed. Because once a court commits to deeper consideration, the ripple effects don't wait. Phones rang late, emails moved quietly. Conversations shifted from confidence to caution. People who had once spoken freely grew silent. Inside Diddy's circle, that silence was noticeable. The energy that had once been loud and defensive became contained, almost guarded. Not because anyone had given up, but because everyone understood the margin for error had narrowed. When scrutiny increases, even strong positions become fragile. This wasn't about panic. It was about recalculation. Every prior move now had to be re-examined through a different lens. What once felt like distance from consequence now felt like proximity, the kind where even small details matter more than they ever did before. Observers noted how quickly the tone changed among those closest to the situation. Conversations weren't about public response anymore. They were about risk, about exposure, about what happens when a process that once felt finite becomes open-ended. Because open-ended processes don't negotiate, they wait. For Cassie, the hours carried a different kind of weight. There was no urgency to speak, no need to respond. The work she had done was already in motion. What followed no longer required her presence or persuasion. That alone marked a shift. For years, her voice had been something people debated, questioned, weighed against power. Now the system was moving independently of her words, guided instead by alignment, context, and record. That separation mattered, because when a process detaches from narrative, it becomes harder to influence and impossible to rush. Behind the scenes, attention began turning toward what comes next, not as speculation, but as preparation. The kind that acknowledges a reality without naming it outright. No one needed to say it. Everyone could feel it. This wasn't drifting toward closure. It was converging toward a decision that would be measured, deliberate, and final in a way the first one never had to be. As the hours stretched on, one truth became clearer by the minute. This case had crossed into a stage where outcomes are shaped quietly, but felt loudly. And once that line is crossed, there's no returning to the way things were before. Because the system doesn't rewind. It only moves forward, carrying everything it has learned with it. The turning point didn't announce itself with noise. It arrived in a pause. According to those familiar with the moment, it came when the judge returned to the material one last time, not to review it, but to connect it. This wasn't about introducing anything new. It was about understanding what the court now knew could no longer be separated. The room was still, not tense, not chaotic, focused. The kind of focus that settles in when a decision has already begun forming beneath the surface. The judge stopped flipping pages. His pen rested on the desk. And for several seconds, nothing happened. No objections, no whispers, no movement. It was the kind of silence that doesn't ask for attention. It commands it. Diddy's legal team felt it immediately. One of them leaned forward slightly as if to interrupt, then stopped. Another lowered their gaze to the table, scanning notes that suddenly felt outdated. The strategies that once felt solid no longer matched the moment unfolding in front of them, because this was no longer about interpretation. It was about implication. Sources say the judge began speaking slowly, choosing each word with precision. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize the moment. He simply made one thing clear. What had been reviewed could not be treated as isolated, incidental, or peripheral. It had context, and context changes everything. That statement shifted the air in the room, because once context is acknowledged, distance disappears. Patterns stop being abstract. They become visible. And when patterns are visible, the system is forced to respond, not emotionally but structurally. Diddy remained seated, but his stillness took on a different meaning. This wasn't patience anymore. It was realization. The kind that hits when you understand the rules of the room have changed, and there's nothing you can do to change them back. Across from him, Cassie didn't move. She didn't react. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. This moment wasn't new to her. The truth had already passed through her life long before it ever reached this room. What changed here wasn't her understanding. It was the courts. And courts don't shift lightly. The judge continued, making it clear that prior conclusions could no longer be treated as fixed without further action. Not because of pressure, not because of public reaction, but because the integrity of the process demanded alignment between what had been known then and what was understood now. That was it. No ruling, no announcement, no final words. But everyone in the room understood exactly what had just happened. The ceiling had lifted. From this point forward, there would be no assumptions about limits. No quiet reliance on what had already been decided. The range of possible outcomes had expanded, and with it, the weight of what was at stake. When the judge signaled the close of proceedings, no one rushed to stand. The room stayed frozen for a moment longer, as if everyone needed time to absorb what had just shifted beneath their feet. Diddy rose slowly when instructed, his expression unreadable but altered. Not broken, not defiant, just aware. A man coming to terms with the fact that the story he once controlled had entered a phase where control no longer mattered. As he was escorted out, the silence followed him. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because everyone knew the same truth. Whatever comes next won't feel sudden. It will feel inevitable. And when it arrives, it won't just mark the end of a case. It will mark the moment everything finally caught up.